All right. I'd like to talk about writing and about audience. So, there are different types of writers. A few years back, I watched a video series entitled Inside Creative Writing. And it was a special done by a university professor and Pulitzer Prize winning author at the university. He worked at the University of Florida, and he had himself filmed while he was writing a short story. And the idea of the program was to give people an idea of what it's like to be a writer, and to get an idea of what his process was for writing. And I found it interesting. Years have passed since I watched that. Probably 5 years have passed, 6 years maybe. And my own method has changed, but I don't think that I've left the premise that he explained, which was that he viewed writing as something that you try to do as an effort to express something within your soul. And I agree with that, and I resonate with that. Dem another way in which you can write, which is kind of like, I call it, sometimes I call it kind of like putting together a Frankenstein monster, you might say. And you take an arm here and a leg there and a brain and a heart from somebody else, and you put it all together, and you then breathe life into the creation. And that is a different kind of writing. And there are people who write because they have something to say. And the people who write because they have something to say can be divided into two groups as well. So there are those who have something to say, and the something they have to say is an ideology. They are evangelists, you might say. They want to convince you of their way of seeing the world. And that's one type of writer. And the other type of writer who has something to say is a person who doesn't really have something to say, but they see the world in a certain way. And this type of writer writes because if they don't write, it is harmful to their soul. And it's as if something has been born inside of them. It's like carrying a baby, and like a seed is planted, and the seed comes from an unseen place, and the seed gets planted inside of you, and it grows until it matures. And then once you have something to say, you have to say it, or else the thing inside of you dies, just like a baby would die if you didn't give birth to the child. The mother has to give birth, or both the mother and the child will die. And it's similar. And so those two things are very different. The person who has something to say, who is kind of, you might say, chanting an ideology, doesn't have the same compulsion. You could almost call it a divine impetus or compulsion to write. But the way to tell the difference is that when you read something by somebody who is, so to speak, chanting some ideology that they believe, it feels like you're being preached to. It feels like someone's trying to sell you something, and the energy, the feeling is vexatious. And it either makes you excited, or it makes you, if you dislike what's being said, it makes you angry. But it stirs something up which is vexatious to the soul. The other type is, whenever you read the other type, if it is inspired from a good source, then it is enlightening to the soul. It brings you closer to the divine. And even if it's something that you may not agree with, it still sheds light to be able to see and hear another person's perspective. That person may not see the world, as you might say, perfectly, or they may not see it just from your own vantage point. But it's enlightening the same way you would be enlightened if, I'm looking at a valley here in these Rocky Mountains that I live in. I'm looking at this valley, and then I get in my car and I go to the other side of the valley, and I look out of the valley from the other side of the valley. It is enlightening to see it from a different perspective. And you have a sense with this type that they are being honest. So they are being honest. You may not agree. You may not see it the same way that they see it. You may see some areas wherein they have, they may have missed some things that you see. But you can tell it's still enlightening because it's an honest perspective. Whereas the people who have something to say, who chant the ideology, it doesn't feel like that. So we've kind of talked about three types of writers, and the one can fit into there's kind of two that fit into one. So the one side is people who have something to say, and then we said the other type was the Frankenstein type. Frankenstein may be a bad way to put it, because I've encountered stories that are written from the Frankenstein mode, which are good stories. They're exciting. They are, or they may be moving. And I won't say that people who write a Frankenstein story don't have anything to say, because they obviously do. And most stories, good stories, have some sort of a moral to the story. And most stories have a moral to the story. And so there are people who write, and the truth is that they're kind of a combination. Like, they have something to say, and they're going about saying it in such a way that is kind of after the Frankenstein model. And the idea with that model is, well, every good story should have these elements. And so they try to create a story that has those elements. But it often has the feeling when you listen to a story that way, that is written in that format, or it was written with that kind of mentality. There's a feeling as you listen to it, if it's not done really well, it's a little bit clunky. You kind of have this sense that's like not every piece of it is totally believable. One of the strange things about the most authentic types of work is that there are elements of the story that clearly are supposed to be there, but which you would never have guessed would be there. People who write stories like that often have the feeling as they write the story that they are surprised by some elements of the story, and they don't know why those elements of the story are there until they finish writing the story. And I love stories like that. And they feel like they're the most honest type of story. And the strange thing about that is they can't be fabricated. It's a reflection of the author, that they're that kind of a person that can write that kind of a story. And I've tried to write those types of stories. The only one that I've ever been able to actually finish is a story called, I called it a cosmic apocalypse, and it's only 10 pages long or so, and it's the story. When I wrote it, I was writing a lot of poetry at the time, and when I wrote the story, I sat down to write, and when I sat down to write, there was something bothering me, and that's how often many of my poems start. And the thing that was bothering me, I sat down to write it out in a poem, and I couldn't. It felt bigger than a poem, but I couldn't get it out, and it was bothering me. It was like there was something in my soul, like a thorn in my if I were a dog, like a thorn in my paw, so to speak. And so I wondered about this, and I sat there for a while, and the next thing I did, and I don't know that I recommend this to people, but I went onto YouTube, and I was drawn to this particular fellow who's of my own kind of political bent, but he's a kind of a vexatious person. He kind of destroys anybody who gets in his way verbally. He's super smart, and even though I agree with several of his views, his his whole spirit and the way he goes about it is of such a dogmatic and ideologically, he's so convinced that he's right that that something about the way he goes about it bothers me. And it bothers me in the same way that I was bothered that day. And I had something to say about that way of going about saying things, or that way of looking at the world. And so I sat there and I just watched video after video from this guy. And it was like it just bothered me more and more and more until finally, it was like it brought it to the surface. And I was able to start writing. And it came out as a story. And I was like, oh, goodness, this is a story. It's not a poem. No wonder it felt bigger than a poem. And I started to write the story. And I kept on writing. And I had this kind of knowing that came, Jonathan, you are actually going to finish this story. And I was like, wow, I was so excited. It was like, I haven't ever been able to finish any of my stories, except for one that was autobiographical. And so I was kind of excited about this, and I wrote, and I kind of knew I would finish, and I kept writing every day. It took me about 10 days to finish it, and I finished the story. And the story kind of surprised me, the direction that it went. And it was a beautiful story. I still love that story. And I was grateful that I was actually able to finish. And it came out of nowhere. So that's the kind of story I'm talking about that I like the best. So there is, but the other type, at its worst, the Frankenstein story, is often clunky. It's what's the word when you can? It's predictable. It's predictable, and it often is unbelievable. The best at writing those types of stories at least have an idea of the craft, and they are good at what they do. They put across the moral of the story without preaching to you, and what they have to say is often very convincing. But there's no, I want to say the word voodoo, but that's the wrong word because it's not. I don't want to give the impression that it's somehow evil, but there's no. It's not so much out of the place. It's not like being a conduit for something, you know what I mean? And I don't put down those stories. I'm not saying that there isn't a good story that's written that way, but it's kind of like piecing things together. And so calling it a Frankenstein story is probably a bad way of putting it, because I've read some good stories that are this way, but I have a sense that they're not the best. And so this is the first part of what I wanted to talk about today, is the idea that there are two places out of which we write. We write out of wanting to tell a story, or we write out of wanting to express some deep thing that is longing to be expressed out of our soul. And I think that the best type of writing comes out of the latter. And it's interesting, when I actually wrote that story that I finished, as I wrote that thing, like, it kind of felt like giving birth spiritually. It was really painful. Like the first day or so, like I couldn't think about anything else. Like my wife would say something to me and I couldn't even quite like hear what she was saying. And I kind of like totally zoned out. It was like, yeah, I had to kind of focus. And I couldn't help but focus. It was like it had taken over, like a woman giving birth, and I couldn't quite control it, and out it came, you know. I remember thinking, I've thought afterwards, like, I would like to be able to do that without it feeling that way, because it was kind of vexatious in and of itself. But not vexatious in a bad way. It was painful in the way, like, giving birth to a child is painful. And so, 2 places to write out of. The reason I started thinking about this today is that I've been thinking about audience, and there's a lot of talk in the writing world about considering your audience and who you're speaking to. And I think that type of thought, it comes more out of the side of things where you're piecing things together. You're piecing a story together, making sure all the parts are there. And it's like, and I think that genre fiction more fits into this. It's like you're considering your audience. Well, who are you writing to? Well, I'm writing to people who are of the horror genre. I'm writing to people who want to be scared out of their wits. Okay, I'm writing to people who are of the adventure genre. I'm writing to the romance genre. I'm writing to this group of people. I'm writing to young adults. I'm writing to older people. And it's like that type of thinking again kind of comes out of that. It's like I'm piecing together something for somebody. And I think this is on my mind because I've been thinking about it lately. I wanted to revise a book that I wrote a few years back, and I found myself thinking about my audience. And one of the things I discovered as I thought about my audience is I found myself thinking about all the people who I don't think like the things I write. I often, when I sit down to say something, I'm trying to convince somebody. I'm trying to convince the skeptic. And I think that I'm realizing more and more that it's like I don't really have an interest too much in speaking to the skeptic. I have an interest in speaking to whoever wants to hear the things that I have to say. And I was speaking to a friend just yesterday, and this friend said, I'm trying to remember how he put it, but he said something to the effect of what was it he said? The people who need to be, the people who can't overlook the language are not the people that we're talking to. In other words, if I have to spell it out in exactly your terms, and I have to say it in the way that you'll understand it, and if you aren't seeking for truth wherever you can find it, and if you'll reject a thing because it's not put in the language that you're used to, then I'm not writing to you. And I thought about that, and that really made sense to me. And I realized that's really the truth. It's like if you're a Christian and you're used to the truth always being packaged for a Christian audience, and if you can't open your mind to anything outside of the way that Christians talk, and I consider myself a Christian, I'm not picking a group other than the group I think I'm a part of. But if that's your view, then I don't think that I'm writing to you. And yet often when I sit down, I'm trying to couch what I say in a way that is palatable to these different people of different backgrounds. And I think because I was raised in a certain framework, I think I'm trying to convince the people of that framework. And I think the reason why it's so hard is because so many people from my own frameworks, I was raised a Mormon. I consider myself still to believe many of the things that that some holy voice within has whispered to me were right about that framework, and I still cling to those things very close to my heart. And I also consider myself to be a believer in Jesus Christ, and I still cling to that. And yet so many of the people from the frameworks that I was raised in, they are not open to the things I have to say, because I don't buy in 100% to everything that is taught within those frameworks. And because I accept truth wherever I can find it. And so I sit down to write, and what I hear, I think, is all of the critics. And, if you're listening to this, if you're a person who has something to say, it's like, I kind of think that the best course is to be authentic. I kind of think the best course is not to write to a particular audience. And, I've listened to Seth Godin. He is a marketing guy, and I've liked some of the things he said. And he's talked about, finding out what your smallest viable market is. And I have grappled with that. What is my smallest viable market? And what he's really saying is, who's your audience? And I think that really works when the product you have to sell, when the thing that you have to present to the world can be boxed up and shipped out. When, it's like you sell tires and you're trying to find a group of people who want your tires or your kind of tires. I think that really works, and he has a very good point. But what do you do when there's just something inside of you that longs to be said, and you have no idea who will receive it? And when your audience is hidden behind 1,000 labels, it'd be so much easier if I could say, well, I think I'm a theologian and I'm a Christian theologian, but I am not. Well, I think I'm a fiction writer. I like to write stories. And then, of course, the question comes, what kind of stories? Well, I don't know. I like to write the stories that best express the thing I see. And I can hear all of the marketers say, but we can't market that. Right. That's the struggle. Isn't that the struggle? Do you find the same thing? Do you find that you have something to say, but you just have to say it, or something will die within you? If so, then we are of the same tribe. We found our group. We found our those of like mind, right? We found each other. It's kind of like being a group of people on the outside of groups. But I cherish you, whoever and whatever you are. If you stick to listening to these, if you continue reading what I write, it's because there's no creed that has no framework, no ideology, and that fits it all. And you long to embrace all truth wherever you can find it, and to to hold it tight to your bosom. And strangely, I think it's that this movement to do that is ageless. It's existed through all time. But strangely, in this time, it seems like it's on the outside, increasingly on the outside of all frameworks. And that's a topic for another day. Frameworks and why it's on the outside right now. God bless you in your own path, I pray. And because of what I see, I pray in the name of Jesus Christ.